now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor João Dionísio, who has been working with us here in Parma for the last month as a visiting professor. So he's very much imbued with the spirit of the city. He is the Duke of Parma, we can say. Professor João Dionísio teaches at the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Lisbon, where he directed the program in textual criticism between 2010 and 2013. He has been a member of the Center for Linguistics at the University of Lisbon, belonging to the philology group, and has focused his research on textual scholarship. His bibliography includes 3 volumes of Fernando Pessoa's critical edition series in 93, 97, and 2004, and the book Doença Bibliográfica, about Pessoa's papers and what to do and not to do with them. He was the president of the European Society for Textual Scholarship in 2013 to 2016. It's your,
well,
you have the floor.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for being here. Let me thank our host, my dear colleague, Professor Martinez, for having organized this one-day colloquium, and of course for having invited me to be part of it. The title of this presentation evidently echoes the famous passage in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, in which Juliet refers to the conventional dimension of names, that is, words with no single unstable meaning associated to them. What's in a rose, that which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet. Something akin to this occurs when one considers a literary list in Fernando Pessoa's archive, as well as its contents. A list will appear to be doubly conventional to the extent that it comprehends rather different types of enumerations and that it is made of rather different types of contents. Why should list be the term to name these also different documents? But the point here is not so much to check the aptness of other terms to name these documents, rather to identify the function the documents themselves played to Pessoa's mind according to what we can see in his archive. It is my belief that through the close observation of these enumerations and their data, our knowledge about the Duke of Parma might be slightly enhanced. To meet this goal, I will proceed by a contrastive analysis of sorts, loosely inspired in some linguistic classifications such as this one, a rather uncomplicated table of oppositional features that portray English verbs. To assist me in this attempt, I will have recourse, even if silently, to perhaps the most comprehensive approach to lists, the one that was carried out by Umberto Eco a little more than 10 years ago, when in November 2009, the Louvre Museum invited Umberto Eco to organize a series of initiatives under a common subject. He immediately accepted the invitation and proposed the list as a topic. One of the outputs of that set of initiatives was Vertigine della Lista, a book / catalog / anthology / essay on lists. To make the most of this meeting between Eco and Pessoa, allow me to start with a common sense remark, and that is, lists as they materially exist in Pessoa's archive are sets that may look like the containers of independent elements. This, however, is a misperception, or at the very least an incomplete statement. The list is more accurately a container of elements, for instance, titles, that refer to other elements. What are these second-degree elements? And the question would be, what do the titles title? The answer to this question is seemingly something in the making, an entity that is rightly represented by Janus, the god of ancient time in ancient Rome, usually pictured as a double-faced man, sometimes an old man. One of the faces looking to the left, to the past, and the other one looking to the future, to the right. Taking into consideration Pessoa's archive, Janus would look back to something A, that materially exists now, before the list is made, and he would also look ahead to something B, something that does not exist now. What is important to state about B is that although it does not exist now, someone, the writer, intends it to exist. Thus, while being non-existent, B is quite different from the elements in sets that do not exist due to their fictional status. This is why the lists of Pessoa's future works, as written down in these lists, does not fall, or they do not fall, under the same category of the fictional works mentioned, for instance, by Rabelais when Pantagruel arrives at the monastery of Saint Victor. The works that are mentioned by Pantagruel include Biga Salutis, Bragueta Iuris, Pantufla Decretorum, Malogranatum Vitiorum, Le Peloton de Théologie, Le Vitemparnare des Prêcheurs, La Quibarine des Preux, and we could go on. And these works do not exist because they are fictional works. As to the Janus-like status of Pessoa's lists, in them we have references to the past, and to put it simply, these are references to archival materials. But these are also references to the future, its outlook being an imaginary set of works by a given author on a book cover. An underlying action in both these past and future dimensions of the elements in Pessoa's lists is selection. Selection plays out in the past in this way. The list denotes something that exists now, and not everything exists now. Selection is also activated when one considers the future, to the extent that everything that one has intended to publish, not everything that one has intended to publish will come out. And additionally, and this is a third situation, a further aspect of selection in the past is drawn from the fact that not everything that exists is mentioned in the lists. So selection in three ways. Out of these two dimensions, past and future, of the Janus-like list, it is the future, without surprise, that has called more attention. In the recent past, the future dimension has been systematically explored by Pedro Sepúlveda, with sometimes the collaboration of Jorge Uribe, namely in their book titled O Planeamento Editorial de Fernando Pessoa's publishing plans. In turn, the past dimension of lists has been largely left unstudied. In this regard, I think it is useful to take a look at this dimension through the lenses of Roman Jakobson's functions of language. As is well known, Roman Jakobson identified 6 main language functions and connected them with several factors, namely the target factor. I would like to suggest that the past dimension of Pessoa's lists is closely linked to 2 functions, the phatic and the cognitive functions, thus seeking to assert the presence of the elements they refer to and to call the observer to action. The observer here being the writer. We are not the observer here, because this is the past dimension. We basically don't exist in the past, considering Pessoa's point of view. It is as if, through the phatic function, the lists were telling the writer, here we are, and through the cognitive function, as if they were giving the order, write on. Consequently, the lists would then work as an aide-mémoire, a to-do calendar. As such, the standing of these lists is much akin to the performative status of rough drafts, a condition that has been put forth by Daniel Ferrer in his book, La logique du brouillon. Okay, given these introductory remarks, let's have a look at the lists kept at Pessoa archive that bear some reference to the Duke of Parma, in order to present a status questionis about chronology, properties, and function. A departing point that will work as a landmark, and it is this landmark that is supposed to work as a point of reference to the findings of the project Enrico Martinez will coordinate. For the sake of method, the recensio, the collection of these materials, the materials that interest us, and the date that is ascribed to each one of them are generally based on the platform digital edition of Fernando Pessoa, projects and publications, and to Pedro Sepúlveda's and Jorge Uribe's book on Pessoa's editorial planning, and to other works. What I did, for starters, was to look for the word Parma on the platform. It sounds a bit strange to say Parma in the English way. And 13 results were obtained, all having to do with the Duke of Parma. So this gives us a clear indication that if you're looking for something like Parma, there is no other project in Pessoa's archive that will be a hit. And based on this corpus, I try to interpret the available data in accordance with three categories, the categories I have mentioned before, so chronology, properties, and function. Starting with chronology, the archive documents that refer to these texts range from a set possibly written down in 1909, and this is probably the star set of the day today, because it has been mentioned by Enrico, it has been mentioned by Teresa, and it will be mentioned later on. This is a set that has not been considered in the digital edition I have mentioned before, because so far that platform does not include every single document with the status of a list. But this apparently is the very first one. It has been mentioned by scholars such as Gianluca Miraglia, Simone Celani. It has been edited by Jerónimo Pizarro, and it is under the spotlight now. This is the look of it. And the last one is a set that was probably written down in February 1933. The more than 2 decades that separate the two documents are a sure sign of Pessoa's insistence on the intention to write this tragedy. But this should not be viewed as a sign per se of the relevance that the author assigned to this project. Instead, it points to the fact that Pessoa was not satisfied with the results he was achieving, and so he would write on and continue to make references to it. If such unsatisfaction resulted from trivial incompleteness, or from the perception that the structure of the drama was not convincing, or that the characters were insufficiently profiled, or from any other reason, it remains to be seen. We don't know. Be that as it may, the Duke of Parma seemingly pertains to what I would call an intermediate category. On the one hand, the Duke is not one of those literary pieces that is rapidly forgotten by the author. A text that once written or studied out is not reworked in itself or in conjunction with other writings. One of those texts, or more accurately put, one of those textual projects that are never mentioned in Pessoa's lists. The Duke is mentioned, and often, in Pessoa's lists. On the other hand, it also does not belong to the small set of texts that, with major or minor differences after the initial draft, were published in the author's lifetime. In between these two sets, those that are doomed to be forgotten and those that came out, one finds a large group of writings that called for his attention during short or lengthy periods of time, literary experiences that he did not abandon after a first go, but that never materialized in published form. Given this framework, let's have a look at the lists that testify to the beginning of the project, such as this one, and to the last known sign of its existence. The first is a list of English items found in the notebook 144D, which goes possibly back to 1909. It mentions the Duke of Parma at the end, followed by Marino. A list dated 1909, even if conjecturally, points to the existence of the listed elements as having been written before that date. And this is a trial and error logical move. If there is a list, something existed before. And this is the interpretive hypothesis. As to the final list, it goes back to mid-February 1933. It was typewritten and deleted by 2 lines shaped as St. Andrew's Cross. The 10 titles displayed by this document are preceded by the indication major, perhaps the shortened form of major works, and is divided into 2 groups of 5. The second one, the bottom one, is only tentatively indicated, as can be seen by several question marks that are placed after the titles. In fact, these question marks are following 4 of the 5 references. In its turn, quite differently, the 5 first references do not bear as many signs of hesitation, and only 2 of those items are followed by the remark or other name. And one of the things that should be underscored is that the title, the Duke of Parma, was settled from very early. The note on the upper right, once every 2 years, means 10 years. The note on the upper right, also typed, is an estimate of the number of years that would take Pessoa to publish the 5 titles, should he spend 2 years with the publication of each one of them, a whole decade. Also, in this regard, the existence of a list dated 1933 means that the writing of the Duke of Parma did not stop in this year, and this is in line with what we have heard before and probably with what we'll be hearing in the following presentations. Now, moving on to the properties of these lists, in their organization there are 2 main properties that are underscored by Pessoa, and those are language and genre. Language performs the major divisions within the sets in lists such as the one written down at the beginning of 1914, its items having been divided into Portuguese, English, and French. The language property is also considered on a calendar page where Pessoa organized the items into a set of references in Portuguese and another set in English. The same organization principle holds in a typescript that goes back to the beginning of the second half of the 1910s, for it is exclusively made up of references to works in English. The language property emerges yet again in another typescript from the beginning of the 1920s, including titles originally composed in English and, this is relevant, English translations of Portuguese titles. Finally, in a list that was also made in the 20s, it is the layout of the document that makes evident how the language property continues to organize the available data. The lower half of the page was here taken with a double column that contains titles in Portuguese, and below the first column, a short section displays English references. Now, if we look at the organization not by language but by genre or textual typology, one of the lists that is a case, an interesting case in point, is this one. This possibly goes back to 1913, it is not entirely certain, and the paired titles denote texts, Marino and the Duke of Parma, that belong to the dramatic genre, being explicitly presented as tragedies. The Duke of Parma, a tragedy, and Marino, a tragedy. It is curious to remark that this double reference goes on occurring in the following lists written in the mid-1910s. For instance, here, the Duke of Parma, a tragedy, Marino, a tragedy, or there, the Duke of Parma, then Prometheus Rebound, and then again Marino. But when we reached had been concluded sometime in the 1920s, and the tragedy focused on this city had gained the distinguished status of drama par excellence, whereas Prometheus Euryvinctus was acknowledged as a poem par excellence. And this process of selection is rather relevant to my mind. Finally, and I'm going to approach now the third feature of these lists, what are the functions that these documents had? To determine the function of these lists is not always an easy task. A few of them, however, provide very clear indications of the role they were supposed to perform. Take 3195, for instance. The remark at the end of this document leaves no room to doubt. And the note reads, "These 6 books sum up all English poems which it is intended to publish for the present." Pessoa seems clear-minded and resolute as to his intentions, but some of the remarks that emerge vis-à-vis titles 3, Prometheus Euryvinctus, to 5, produced the impression that he was not that sure about the content of each book. Let's have a closer look at each one of them. Regarding 3, the note "Poems like What Evil Planet" and the like suggest that he had not still made a selection of the poetry that would follow Prometheus Euryvinctus. As far as 4 is concerned, its content would partially depend on the decisions Pessoa would make about the poems mentioned in 3. And I quote, "All the poems that are good enough to be published and that are neither sonnets nor so stable or intellectually lyrical as to be included in the third part of the book number 3. And this is clearly rather a distance from being sure about the pieces he was intending to publish. And finally, the one numbered 5. Book 5 doesn't even bear a title, apart from not being associated with a clear content. By far the furthest project of all 3, the remark that Pessoa writes down is especially telling, for it almost plays out as a passage taken from a stream of consciousness. Leave these to be settled afterwards. If indeed such poems are worth publishing, consider also A Winter Day and the other poem, whichever it is, which is the 5th one in the old division of the long poems into 2 books of 5 in the second of these books. In contrast to these signs of uncertainty, titles 1, 2, and 6 is the Duke of Parma, are seemingly near finished products. He's apparently sure with a stable decision about the content and the intention to publish these. As a matter of fact, and although not in this exact manner, Title 1 is at the origin of 2 booklets published in Pessoa's lifetime. Not 3 unprintable poems, but in a clear allusion to their erotic content, 2 unprintable, though printed, poems, Antinous and Epithalamium. Similarly, Title 2 would be printed not under the title of 80 sonnets, but after some trimming work, 35 sonnets. This allows us to think that around 1916, 1917, that is immediately before 1918, when the first edition of these booklets came out, the Duke of Parma was as concluded to Pessoa's eyes as to envisage the future publication in English of this tragedy. Sometimes it is much harder than in the case of the list I have just presented to identify the function of these sets. The last list I would like to consider, and these are reliving news, the last list I would like to consider in this paper displays the head classification. It is made up of 41 numbered items, the item 11 being the Duke of Parma. 11, Duke of Parma. The title is mentioned without the article "the," one of many abbreviations to be found in this document, along with general references and references marked by doubt. The items referred to in this list have reached different statuses, some of them more clearly profiled, for instance 16, poemas em conjuntos, followed by the remark, already chosen, and others such as 6, poetry for later choice, as a set to become an object of selection. Therefore, apart from the heterogeneous assortment of materials, these include poetry, astrology, detective stories, and translations. These texts would consist of clearly defined sets and others only provisionally profiled. What is the function of such an enumeration? If I read them correctly, Sepúlveda and Uribe are inclined to see it as a list for future publications, underscoring the importance of item 41, in fact, the very last item. And 41 is plans and similar notes. According to them, this would mean that lists, plans, and publishing notes are to be viewed in Pessoa's own terms as part of his work. This seems to me a typical case of Russell's paradox, when he pointed out to the existence of two types of sets. A set which does not contain itself, this is a normal set. The example can be a duke cannot be a set of dukes, and an abnormal set, a set which contains itself. A list can be a list, a set of lists. Sepúlveda and Uribe seem to take classification as an example of B, a list that contains lists. Visually, this would be similar to a special type of reliquary, a container for the remains of a saint that is shaped in the form of the relics it contains. For instance, a container in the form of an arm because it is supposed to keep inside the remains of an arm. No matter how appealing, and this is truly appealing, no matter how appealing this interpretive move is, I would tend to see this list in a different guise. The head classification points to the organization of all the items it displays, regardless of Pessoa's intentions vis-à-vis each one of them. Sure, some of them were meant to be published, but those items are actually a part of the whole set. Accordingly, the function seems to me to be strictly archival. This list being thus an attempt to organize a set of materials, and very heterogeneous materials at that. Despite this different point of view, you may be led to think that I would tend to agree with Sepúlveda and Uribe in another matter. The classification document would be a list containing other lists, namely itself. For the sake of clarification, allow me to say that also in this regard, my interpretation does not follow theirs, for two reasons. First, because in my opinion, item 41, plans and similar notes, does not refer primarily to lists, rather to what French genetic critics call scénario and discursive remarks. Second, because even if it did, we would miss the point I tried to underscore at the beginning of this paper. There are no lists of lists, only lists of references to lists. Lists of references to lists of lines, to lists of poems, to lists of pieces of prose. Consequently, I would hold the view that a reliquary is a fairly good visual representation of what we are dealing with here, the remains of a body, a textual body at that, and largely a body of textual work that never materialized in published form. But this reliquary does not display the shape of its contents. This reliquary is a chest or a casket with very different items inside. Thank you so much for your attention. After this tedious, so very tedious tour around lists that mentioned the Duke of Parma, let me wrap up this paper with 4 concluding remarks, and this goes very swiftly. 1. The list documents a lengthy and unfinished genesis of this tragedy. 2. The list documents the obvious relevance of this project, namely when Pessoa was seriously thinking of becoming a writer in English. And this to me has core importance. 3. The selective dimension of the lists point to the idea that at a given stage, the Duke of Parma became in Pessoa's mind his best representative of drama written in English. 4. When he realized that quite probably a significant part of his work would be left unpublished, Pessoa did not miss to include the Duke of Parma in the classification of his documents. Put together, this seems more than enough to roll up our sleeves and delve deep into the hows, the whens, and the whats of this drama by Fernando Pessoa. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you for this captivating, I would say, and detailed input.
Thank you.
And we are perfectly on time, so I think we can go on with some questions if there are.
Yeah, 2 minutes
Some.
more. I'm sorry.
So are there any questions?
Now absorbing.
Not even Geronimo?
Everyone is thinking about lunch.
The only thing is, I was mentioning the other day that
Some of the images that João Dionísio presented were presented 30 years ago by Anne Terlinden when she was studying the Mad Fiddler. So we had some hints of the Duke of Parma when she was studying the Mad Fiddler, and I think we were talking about this yesterday. I think we are in a way, that's what I feel, going back to when Amina Di Muno was studying the Il Violinista Pazzo, and she published the book in Italian. When Anne Terlinden was publishing in the 80s The Mad Fiddler, and when Fernando Gomez and Johnny, Marcus and Johnny published The Mad Fiddler for the critical edition. And I think those are some sources that we will have to go back and read again, because some documents that we are mentioning now were already mentioned by them 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, but if I may, and thank you, Jeronim, for pointing that out. The thing is, of course, we have always to go back. But if we start listing all the people that have mentioned every single one of these documents, in the end we have the list, but nothing else. So, but
most of them are Italian.
no, well, and Terlinden is not Italian, Marcos Angioni is not Italian, and Fernando Gomes, to the best of my knowledge, is not Italian as well. But the thing is, the link between the Duke of Parma and the Mad Fiddler, I think it may prove very fruitful. And do you recall the date when Fernando Pessoa is writing to some publishers in England, asking to checking whether they would be welcoming the publication of the Mad Fiddler? Do you remember the year?
No, it's not very well established. I think we still have to work on that date, but it's more or less 1915, 1916.
Okay.
Because in 17 he is already planning to distribute copies of the Mad Fiddler.
Yeah. So I think that first perfectly fits into this
Yes, exactly.
tentative picture. That is, we can draw
yes,
a line, an
yes,
ascending
yes.
line, and the interest
Like,
is growing until
yes.
15, 16,
Yes.
17, and there you have a frontier.
Yes,
He
exactly.
really reaches the zenith of
Yes.
zenith.
Yes, yes,
He
yes.
reaches the zenith in terms of intention, and for a
Yeah.
very solid intention to publish, and progressively after what is a very moderate success
Yeah.
of the book, let's say in English, he starts deflating his expectations regarding the
Yes.
Duke of Parma,
Yes.
but not abandoning the project, but clearly the temperature
Yeah,
starts
and
to become a bit
yes,
lowered
yeah.
from then on.
And
I would
there is-
say during the 20s.
Yes,
maybe.
yes, I agree. And I think there is like a before and after the English poems.
Yeah.
And that maybe, we don't know yet, there are two important phases, as with the Book of Disquiet. So in the 10s, in the 1910s, and then in the 1920s, 30s, but two different phases. And maybe the Duke of Parma was written with two different aesthetic views in mind in two different moments.
we'll
That's
have to
something we
check
don't
that.
know.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have text before and after the English poems, yes.
Professor Saglia.
Thank you. Well, since one of the aims of today is just to share doubt and ignorance, basically, I feel perfectly entitled to showing my entire ignorance and sort of sharing with you some of the ideas or the, well, not even ideas, maybe it's more like possibilities. Already from this couple of extremely interesting papers. Some of them are doubts as well. While I was listening to Teresa and João speaking, I thought to myself, and these are all things that I put out there that might direct or not our discussion. Okay, I'll try to connect everything. Number one, how useful is it for us to think of this text primarily in terms of fixed genres? We've been calling it João, tragedy, tragedy, tragedy. We've been talking about it as a drama, as a theatrical text. Is this going the right way? Could we be fixing this text into a generic frame that, for us, sort of already sets a certain type of approach? Or should we, at this point, sort of keep it a little bit more open? And I'll tell you why I've got this. I'm not saying that it's not a drama, obviously, or it's not a theatrical text, but could this be sort of prefiguring a certain line of approach instead of keeping our minds open? And I'm saying this, again, as a kind of doubt, which I sort of share with you completely as a non-specialist, but perhaps sometimes external points of view might be useful, because if I saw a point of connection between your two contributions, was the question of knowledge. The more I listen to you, and of course there are more interesting things coming this afternoon, is that one of the points was that this is a text about knowledge, about how to reach knowledge, about how to organize knowledge or to construct knowledge when it comes to the text itself or when it comes to the lists as well. So in terms of this, if the text is an instrument to sort of know and to decide how we know something, it might be useful not to constrict it into, already right from the start, into a generic label. Keep it there as a working concept. And then two questions. Teresa, do you agree with, I seemed to sense that in your paper you were aiming at this, talking about Condillac, but also talking about Oscar Wilde trying to, doing detective work, which is extremely epistemic, about the figure of Mr. W.H. So I could see that there was this drift in your talk, that you're approaching these materials, which we are calling a tragedy or a drama, as sort of kept together by this focus on how we know, how we produce knowledge, how language structures knowledge and presents knowledge. And probably another version of this question could work for João as well. And the list, not just as a way of organizing what there was, what there might be, but also, again, as a kind of an epistemic tool in order to gather knowledge about the writer, where he is at this moment, where he wants to go. So also as an instrument to sort of circumscribe the real, the actually real, or the potentially real. Very non-philological reflections and potentially very useless, but there we go. This is what I have at the moment.
Teresa, do you want to reply?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Diego. Well, I agree with you. First, we are still deciphering the text, so I think we'll be surprised by it. We ought to be. We shouldn't be heading to a definite genre by now, but be open-minded to it and let the text guide us. That's what we are trying to do. So my focus did indeed went to the philosophy of language and how do we know. because I was able to link these small pieces of text from the Duke of Parma, this insistence, well, I shouldn't call it insistence because we don't have the full knowledge of the text to talk about it, but these 4 or 5 occurrences that I was able to identify focused on language. So this is just a suggestion now to maybe understand that the text may be focusing not just on madness, crime, sexual illusions, well, these pieces of knowledge that we already know that the play might have, but also a reflection of it, a philosophical inquiry on these matters. And my suggestion is only to help deciphering more of the text and of the character. But then again, once we have the full text, we might change our minds. That is it. I'm not sure if I answered your questions, but that was my suggestion, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Diego, for your remarks. I agree with you, meaning that I agree with Teresa as far as the genre issue comes up. And so it was just out of easiness during the presentation that I realize now maybe I have always identified the text as a drama or a tragedy. And yes, methodologically, it places us all on safer ground if you don't take that for granted. Mm-hmm. Because to speak of drama does not necessarily mean that he's speaking of tragedy, and what he the meaning he ascribes to tragedy has to be seen carefully as well. Another reason to be cautious in this respect is that, at least for those of us who have been getting in touch for some time now with Pessoa Archive, we are aware of the mobility of fragments from one project to another, and so seen in itself, this can have the outlook of a drama text, but then we can find exactly the same piece included in a collection of poetry, for instance. And that is the case of Alexander Search. In Alexander Search, if I remember correctly, some pieces of dramatic writing are imported to a collection of lines of poetry. So if I gave the impression that I was in niche, I would like to take this opportunity to correct, because that is not the way I see it. The answer to your second question is quite disappointing, I must say, because you were thinking about the hypothesis of taking the list as an heuristic tool to organize. And I'm a lover of Pessoa's list, but from all our experience, having a close relationship with someone, sometimes it is hard and demanding, and the same thing happens regarding lists. The problem, to my mind, is that part of the charm of the lists is that they escape the status of being an all easygoing tool of interpretation, because they themselves are subject to interpretation. Let me give you just a very brief example. When I was talking about this last set of elements, the classification list, Pedro Sepúlveda and Jorge Uribe, quite to the point, mentioned that in this list there is no reference whatsoever to the Book of Disquiet. So all of a sudden you start thinking, why should not the Book of Disquiet being mentioned here? Because obviously it is a relevant work, it was a relevant work to his mind, Some parts of it were published, but most of it was not. Looking at the list, you have to think, what is the meaning of these references here, and what is the meaning of an indeterminate number of references that are not there? I think it is impossible to know. I think it is simply not possible. And the moment someone assumes that it is not possible, you cannot use a tool if you see that something is lacking or something is present, but you don't know exactly what that is, what is the function that that thing is playing there. So at least for the time being, I would not dare to use it in a very confident way as a tool of interpretation. And I cannot picture myself in the following 40 years changing my mind. 50 years, I would say. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think that ends our morning session. Thank you all for being with us, and the conference will resume at 3 o'clock.